December 1944. A foxhole in the Ardennes forest, Belgium. An American infantryman pulls a canteen from inside his field jacket. The water is chlorine-tinted, a taste he has learned to tolerate rather than enjoy. He drinks. He will not get sick from it. He will move when ordered to move. The water will not be the reason he dies tonight. 2 years earlier, in a different winter, a different army faced a different outcome. At Stalingrad, German soldiers of the encircled 6th Army were dying not only from cold and Soviet fire, but from dysentery, typhus, and the collapse of every basic sanitary function an army requires to survive. Historian Antony Beevor's account, drawn from German medical records and survivor testimony, describes latrines where men too weak from dysentery to climb out died where they had fallen. Lice carried typhus from soldier to soldier in the freezing trenches. The German command's fear of typhus was severe enough that Polish resistance fighters later exploited it deliberately to disrupt occupation logistics, spreading deliberately misleading reports of typhus outbreaks in specific districts, knowing German occupation troops would avoid those areas out of genuine institutional dread of the disease that had already devastated their own army on the Eastern Front. Both armies ate roughly comparable rations. Both fought enemies of comparable lethality. Both, in many specific instances, drew water from rivers and wells that looked identical to the naked eye. One army's soldier survived the encounter with that water as a matter of routine. The other army's soldier had a meaningful statistical chance of dying from it. The difference was not a weapon. A German major captured near Liège, interrogated by American intelligence officers in the final months of the war, asked his interrogators a question that the transcript records without elaboration. Why did American soldiers always have water? He was not asking about thirst. He was asking about an institutional achievement that no army before 1944 had fully solved: how to deliver water that would not kill the man drinking it, reliably, to every individual soldier, regardless of where the front line happened to be on a given day. To understand why this question stunned a professional German officer, the story has to begin not in the Ardennes, and not even in the Second World War. It begins in 1898, in a sweltering training camp in Florida, where the United States Army learned a lesson that would not pay its full dividend for another 46 years. For the first century and a half of American military history, the deadliest force facing the American soldier was not a foreign army. It was a microorganism invisible to the naked eye. The numbers, drawn from official U.S. Army medical histories, are difficult to absorb on first reading. Of the approximately 620,000 military deaths in the American Civil War, roughly 2/3 resulted from disease rather than combat. The single largest killer was not the rifle ball or the artillery shell. It was dysentery and chronic diarrhea, bacterial infections transmitted through fecal contamination of food and water supplies. The Union Army alone recorded more than 1.5 million cases of intestinal disease during the war, with approximately 57,000 deaths directly attributable to those infections. Typhoid fever, also waterborne, killed thousands more. Soldiers weakened by chronic dysentery often succumbed to wounds that a healthy man would have survived. The mechanism was ancient and well understood by physicians even then. Armies dug latrines upstream of the wells they drank from. Soldiers filled canteens from creeks where a dead animal lay decomposing a quarter-mile upstream. Confederate camps suffered comparably. Some regimental surgeons reported intestinal disease rates exceeding 50% of effective strength during extended encampments, a figure that made disease, rather than Union artillery, the most reliable instrument reducing Confederate combat power over the course of a campaign season. Army surgeon Joseph Janvier Woodward documented the connection in his 1863 study of camp diseases, establishing the link between contaminated water and mass casualties years before the war ended. Understanding the problem and solving it at scale were two entirely different undertakings, and in 1863, only the first was achievable. The germ theory of disease itself would not be widely accepted by the medical establishment for another 2 decades. Woodward's observational correlation between water source and illness predated any mechanistic understanding of why the correlation existed. The Spanish-American War, 35 years later, demonstrated how little had actually changed, despite the intervening decades of medical advancement elsewhere. Of roughly 171,000 American personnel mobilized in 1898, more than 20,000 were hospitalized with typhoid fever. The Army recorded 2,192 typhoid deaths by year's end. Combat deaths for the entire war numbered 379, or by broader counts including all combat-related fatalities, 968. By any reasonable accounting, American drinking water killed several times more American soldiers than Spanish bullets did. The camps themselves were textbook examples of the failure mode. At Camp Thomas in Chickamauga, Georgia, latrines were sited too close to kitchen areas and water sources alike, in a layout error that any officer with Civil War medical literature on his shelf could have identified and corrected before a single regiment arrived. The scale of the 1898 mobilization made the underlying problem worse rather than better. The Army had expanded from a peacetime force of roughly 28,000 to nearly 6 times that size within months, drawing in volunteer regiments commanded by officers with no professional sanitary training and assembled in camps that had been agricultural land weeks earlier, with no permanent water or waste infrastructure of any kind. Camp Alger in Virginia, Camp George H. Thomas in Georgia, and several other major mobilization sites all reported typhoid rates that horrified Army physicians who had read Woodward's Civil War findings and recognized the same failure pattern repeating itself 35 years later, this time against an enemy, Spain, that the United States defeated in a matter of months with a combat death toll that the camps themselves dwarfed several times over. Surgeon General George Sternberg ordered an investigation. The board he assembled was led by a young Army physician named Walter Reed, whose subsequent yellow fever research would make him internationally famous. Reed's team toured the camps, traced the disease's spread, and confirmed what British physician William Budd had argued as early as 1839. Typhoid traveled through human waste, contaminating drinking water. The Reed Board's official report, published in 1904, remains a foundational document in American military medicine. What the report could not immediately produce was a fix that worked in the field rather than in a laboratory. That gap, between knowing the cause and being able to act on the knowledge at the scale a deployed Army required, was the problem the next generation of Army officers spent 3 decades solving. His name was William John Lyster, born in 1869, the son of a Civil War Army surgeon. He was commissioned into the Army Medical Corps and spent years in the kind of unremarkable garrison postings that define most peacetime military medical careers. Around 1910, he developed a specific and unglamorous interest: how to kill the bacteria in a barrel of water without poisoning the man who subsequently drank from it. Lyster had watched the Spanish-American War's typhoid camps as a junior officer, early enough in his career to absorb the lesson of 1898 without yet having the institutional authority to act on it. By the time he turned his attention seriously to water purification around 1910, he had also observed the British experience in the Boer War, where typhoid had killed roughly 6 times as many British soldiers as Boer bullets had, a ratio that closely mirrored the American experience in Cuba, and that suggested the problem was not specific to American sanitary failures, but a structural feature of how every modern army handled field water. The underlying chemistry was not new. Calcium hypochlorite, bleaching powder in everyday terms, had been used to treat municipal water supplies in Britain and the United States since the late 19th century. Cities had solved the chemistry problem. What they had not solved was portability. A municipal treatment plant requires concrete tanks, electrical pumps, trained engineers, and laboratory equipment. None of that travels in a field pack, and none of it can be assembled and disassembled daily as an army advances or retreats. Lyster's contribution, perfected by 1913 and formally adopted by the Army in 1917, was almost insultingly simple. He took a heavy canvas bag, lined it with rubber to control the leak rate, fitted 6 small spigots around the bottom, and added a cloth lid to keep out dust and insects. The bag held 36 gallons and weighed almost nothing empty. Soldiers strung it from a tripod of cut branches, away from any tree where birds might roost overhead, filled it with the cleanest available local water, added a precisely measured dose of calcium hypochlorite, and waited 30 minutes. A reagent test confirmed the residual chlorine level. If the test failed, they added a second dose and waited 10 more minutes. That was the entire procedure. The device became known as the Lister bag. By the end of the First World War, it was standard equipment in every American field kitchen and bivouac, present with Pershing's punitive expedition into Mexico in 1916 before the formal 1917 adoption, and standard across every American Expeditionary Force encampment in France by 1918. It remained in continuous service through the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam. 60 years of unbroken use from a piece of equipment that cost less than a single pair of boots, until reverse osmosis units finally replaced it after Vietnam. The Lister bag alone could not reach a rifleman 500 yards into a forest carrying a single canteen on his hip. While the bag became standard equipment at the company level, two other researchers, British organic chemist Henry Dakin and American pathologist Edward Dunham, were solving the individual soldier problem during the same war. Working separately and then jointly, they developed a stable chlorine-releasing compound, dichlorosulfamoyl benzoic acid, that could be pressed into a tablet small enough for a single canteen. They called it Halazone. 2 tablets, 30 minutes of contact time, and the most common bacterial threats in the water were neutralized. The tablets had real limitations: a pronounced chlorine taste, a shortened shelf life once the bottle was opened, slower action against certain pathogens, but for individual field use, they worked reliably. Through the 1920s and 1930s, while the Army's overall budget was being slashed nearly to nothing during the Depression, a small group of officers in the Quartermaster Corps and the medical department kept refining this system. They wrote field manuals specifying exact ampule counts per battalion per day. They trained dedicated sanitation specialists. They continued ordering Lister bags and Halazone bottles through budget cycles in which no congressman considered water purification a meaningful line item. Every other industrialized military had access to the identical underlying chemistry. The British Royal Army Medical Corps used the Horrocks box, named for Sir William Heaton Horrocks, combining sand filtration with chlorine sterilization. The German Wehrmacht issued bleach tubes and chlorine-neutralizing compounds for company and battery-level water treatment, along with the Tornister Filtergerät, a portable backpack filtration unit that American intelligence captured and analyzed, publishing the findings in tactical bulletins as early as November 1943. The chemistry was never secret. What no other nation built was the system surrounding the chemistry. By 1942, when the 1st American Division stepped off transport ships in North Africa and across the Pacific, that system existed in 3 distinct tiers, though almost no one who used it would have described it in those terms. Tier 1 operated at the individual level. Every soldier carried a canteen, and Halazone tablets traveled with him in his ration pack. The K-ration breakfast unit, the most widely issued field ration of the war, included Halazone tablets alongside instant coffee and the standard chopped ham and eggs. C-ration accessory packs carried them through 1945. The Jungle First Aid Kit and the Aeronautical First Aid Kit each included a sealed bottle of 100 tablets manufactured by Abbott Laboratories. Pacific veterans described the routine with the specific tedium of a habit performed thousands of times. Dip the canteen in a stream, drop in 2 tablets, screw on the cap, shake it, hang it on the belt, wait 20 minutes, drink. Post-war reviews by the Army Medical Department's Technical Committee confirmed the tablets remained effective even from bottles a year or 2 old, and that soldiers who followed the protocol consistently avoided waterborne illness. The protocol's specific weakness was compliance rather than chemistry. Exhausted, thirsty soldiers under combat stress sometimes skipped the 20-minute wait or omitted the tablets altogether, and medical officers documented periodic outbreaks traceable to individual noncompliance rather than to any failure in the underlying chemistry. Tier 2 operated at the unit level. Every company, battery, and field kitchen maintained at least 1 Lister bag, with larger units fielding several. A trained sanitation NCO, present in every company-sized unit, filled the bag from the cleanest available source, added the chlorine compound, waited the prescribed interval, tested the residual, and opened the spigots. The bag itself was cleaned with its own diluted chlorine solution before each refill, a small mechanical ritual repeated tens of thousands of times daily across every active theater. This tier represented the system's most reliable layer, precisely because it removed individual compliance from the equation entirely. A soldier drawing water from a properly maintained company Lister bag received purified water regardless of whether he personally bothered with, or even understood, the chemistry behind it. Tier 3 is where the American system diverged completely from every other army in the war: dedicated infrastructure. The U.S. Army fielded entire formations whose sole mission was producing, purifying, storing, and distributing water at scale. The 405th Engineer Water Supply Battalion supported 5th Army through North Africa, Sicily, and Italy from 1943 to 1945. In the Pacific, the 1517th and 1519th Engineer Water Supply Companies operated in Manila, while the 1518th served on Biak. Black engineer units, including the 96th Engineer General Service Regiment, built water points across the Pacific, Burma, North Africa, and Europe. Their contributions frequently uncredited in post-war records, despite their operational importance, a pattern consistent with the broader historical under-recognition of segregated engineer units whose technical labor underpinned campaigns credited entirely to combat formations. These units drilled wells, captured natural springs, built reservoirs from canvas and rubber, and operated portable purification rigs. The engineering challenge varied enormously by theater. In North Africa, water supply units frequently had to locate and develop wells in terrain the retreating Axis forces had deliberately fouled or destroyed, requiring both hydrological expertise to find viable sources and chemical expertise to render contaminated sources usable. Retreating German forces in Tunisia and Libya sometimes poisoned wells with petroleum products or simply collapsed the wellheads, a tactic intended to slow the Allied advance by forcing engineer units to either locate alternative sources or spend critical hours restoring damaged ones. Time that, in a campaign measured in days and hours of advance, carried genuine operational cost. In the Pacific, the problem was often the opposite. Abundant rainfall and surface water, but water saturated with organic contamination and parasitic load far beyond anything European sanitation doctrine had anticipated, requiring purification dosing rates substantially higher than the standard field manual specified for temperate climates. Engineer units in New Guinea and the Philippines developed informal dosing adjustments through direct field experience well before those adjustments were formally incorporated into revised manuals, a pattern of bottom-up doctrinal correction that the Army's institutional structure was unusually willing to absorb and codify rather than resist. Late in the war, the Army Engineer Research and Development Laboratory at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, fielded a van-mounted, electrically driven purification unit, officially designated the Water Purification Unit Van-Type Body-Mounted, known informally to the soldiers who used it as the Lator. A single unit could produce between 1,000 and 3,000 gallons of potable water daily, sufficient to supply an infantry battalion under harsh field conditions. The unit's design reflected lessons learned specifically from the early Pacific campaigns, a sealed system with minimal exposed surfaces vulnerable to contamination, multiple filtration stages capable of handling the high organic load of tropical water sources, and a chlorination stage with adjustable dosing to compensate for water quality that varied dramatically from one captured position to the next. By the war's later stages, these mobile units moved forward with combat divisions, establishing operational water points within hours of a position being secured. An American battalion taking ground in Belgium or on Luzon could expect an engineer water detachment arriving close behind it, manufacturing drinking water at the new position from whatever local source the terrain offered, often the same day the ground was taken. This forward deployment pattern represented a deliberate doctrinal choice rather than an improvised adaptation. Water supply units were integrated into divisional logistics planning at the same level as ammunition and fuel resupply, with specific unit assignments and movement schedules built into operational orders well before an assault began. The German approach, by contrast, required a hygiene inspection by a medical officer before water could be issued, followed by portable filtration through the Tornister Filtergerät or older AF2 and F4 models dating to the First World War, with chlorine and a hydrogen peroxide-based neutralizer applied at company level. The doctrine existed. The training existed. What did not exist was an industrial water supply branch operating at the scale and forward deployment tempo of its American counterpart. There was no German equivalent of the 405th Engineer Water Supply Battalion, and no German equivalent of the Later. In the deep North African desert, drinking water for Rommel's Panzer Army arrived by petrol can, hauled along a single coastal road sometimes hundreds of kilometers from port, rationed at roughly 4.5 liters per man per day, of which historians of the campaign estimate roughly half went to cooking and topping off vehicle radiators rather than drinking. The German soldier on the line often had perhaps 2 liters of actual drinking water daily, in a desert where his American or British counterpart had access to several times that volume. German logistics planners were not unaware of the problem. Rommel himself repeatedly flagged water supply as a critical operational constraint in his correspondence with German High Command, requesting additional transport capacity specifically for water that competed directly with fuel and ammunition for the same limited truck fleet. The constraint was not doctrinal ignorance. It was an industrial and logistical capacity that German war production, strained across multiple fronts, could not match. This is the answer the German major near Liège could not quite articulate. He thought he was describing a technology. The system would solve it for him. Whether that philosophy could survive contact with the worst environmental conditions any modern army had faced is a question the Pacific Theater and the Battle of the Bulge answered with brutal specificity. The Pacific was, by nearly every measurable index, the harshest environment the U.S. Army fought in during the entire war. Not primarily because the Japanese soldier outfought the German soldier, a question historians still debate, but because climate, terrain, and microbial load added a third combatant to every engagement: heat, humidity, standing water, mosquitoes, and waterborne parasites in nearly every stream a unit crossed. The published figures are extraordinary. The U.S. Army recorded approximately 17 million hospital admissions worldwide during the war for illness or accident, against roughly 1 million admissions for combat casualties, a ratio of 17-1. In the early Pacific campaigns, the imbalance was worse still. Some estimates place non-combat casualties from heat and disease at roughly 100 for every casualty the enemy inflicted directly. In the South Pacific Theater between 1942 and 1945, recorded cases included 756,849 instances of dysentery and diarrheal disease, 572,950 cases of malaria, and 121,168 cases of dengue fever. Every man who served on Guadalcanal contracted malaria at some point during the campaign. An average of more than 5,000 soldiers were on the sick list daily from malaria alone. General Douglas MacArthur, according to Dr. Paul Russell of the Army's Malaria Control Branch, complained that for every division he had facing the Japanese, he needed to account for a second division in hospital and a third recovering. Malaria, unlike dysentery, was not primarily a water transmission problem. It spread through mosquito vectors rather than contaminated drinking supplies. But the broader sanitary infrastructure that the water system represented extended naturally into mosquito control, latrine siting, and the general discipline of treating tropical disease as an engineering problem rather than an unavoidable cost of jungle warfare. The same officers who managed Lister bags and Halazone distribution typically held responsibility for malaria discipline within their units, enforcing atabrine doses, requiring sleeves down at dusk, supervising the draining of standing water near camps. The water system and the broader tropical disease system were institutionally intertwined, run by the same sanitation specialists, applying the same underlying philosophy that no soldier should be left to manage an invisible biological threat through individual judgment alone. The Army Sanitary Corps, formally established during the First World War and expanded dramatically by 1942, trained these specialists at a scale no other belligerent matched. Roughly 40,000 field sanitation specialists passed through Army schools during the war, a figure large enough that nearly every company-sized unit in every theater had at least one soldier formally certified in water testing, latrine construction, and basic disease vector control. The certification process itself was brief by design, a matter of weeks rather than the years required for a medical degree, because the doctrine assumed, correctly, that the knowledge required to run a Lister bag and read a chlorine test kit did not require physicians' training, only consistent procedure and institutional backing to enforce it. And yet the American Army survived the Pacific at a casualty rate from disease that was catastrophic by any normal historical measure, but vastly lower than it would have been without the three-tier system. Without the Lister bags, the Halazone tablets, and the water supply companies establishing purification points on newly captured beaches within 24 hours of a landing. The underlying assumption, rarely stated explicitly even in official histories, was that no American soldier in the line was expected to drink unpurified water if any chain of supply could possibly reach him. The Japanese garrison on the same islands had no equivalent system. By late in the Pacific War, with American submarines severing their supply lines, Japanese troops on bypassed islands suffered combat ineffectiveness rates that Allied medical observers estimated at 90%, driven by the combination of malaria, dysentery, and starvation. Japanese military medical doctrine was not ignorant of waterborne disease. Japanese army physicians understood the same germ theory that American physicians did. But Japan's logistic system, strained by the scale of the Pacific theater and increasingly severed by American naval and submarine interdiction after 1943, could not deliver purification equipment and replacement chemical stock to isolated garrisons at anything resembling the rate the American system achieved. December 1944 tested the system under entirely different conditions. In the Ardennes, nighttime temperatures fell to 30 and 40 degrees below zero. Tanks froze to the ground. Wounded men froze to death before stretcher teams could reach them. And canteens, the foundation of Tier 1, froze solid within a few hours of exposure. William Schuchert, an American infantryman whose account survives in the Army's own records of the battle, described his platoon's routine. 6 men sharing a foxhole roofed with cut branches, reluctant to leave it because German shelling was nearly continuous. They rotated the task 1 man at a time, each soldier crawling out to refill the other's canteens at a nearby stream. On one such trip, Schuchert reached the usual water point and found 3 dead German soldiers in the stream. He moved further downstream to a cleaner-looking section, filled the canteens, and started back as German shelling resumed. Shrapnel struck his rifle and blew the top off his own canteen. He survived. Not every soldier on that kind of errand did. Halazone tablets work more slowly in cold water, sometimes requiring double the standard contact time. Lister bags could freeze solid overnight, and quartermaster units in the Ardennes sector resorted to wrapping bags in blankets or positioning them near field kitchen fires when tactically possible, neither solution being part of any approved field manual, but both representing the kind of improvised adaptation that experienced sanitation NCOs applied when standard procedure met conditions the procedure's authors had never anticipated. Forward water points were sometimes 2 or 3 miles behind the line during the worst of the German offensive, a distance that, under normal circumstances, was a minor inconvenience, and under combat conditions, with constant artillery fire, became a genuine hazard for any soldier assigned the resupply run. The system was stretched nearly to its breaking point, but it held through the harshest winter of the European campaign, delivering water to men eating frozen rations and warming canteens against their own bodies. Army quartermaster records from the Bulge document specific adaptations. Water points relocated closer to the front than doctrine normally specified, given the freezing risk of longer transport. Increased halazone dosing to compensate for the slower cold water reaction rate. And in at least several documented instances, engineer units melting snow directly for emergency water production when stream access was too dangerous to attempt, using portable heating elements intended for other equipment. The contrast with Stalingrad 2 years earlier is not a claim of moral equivalence between the two campaigns. The German Sixth Army was cut off entirely from its supply system in a way the American forces in the Ardennes never were. The German encirclement at Stalingrad represented total logistics collapse. No resupply by any means except a starvation-level airlift that delivered a fraction of the tonnage the trapped army required for fuel, food, ammunition, and medical supplies combined. Water purification chemicals, never a priority item even in functioning German logistics, were among the first categories of supply to disappear entirely once the airlift became the sole resupply mechanism. But the contrast does reveal something about how each system performed under maximum strain, even accounting for the different severity of the two crises. When the German supply line collapsed at Stalingrad, the German soldier was left entirely on his own, with no institutional mechanism designed to operate under exactly that kind of stress. When the American supply line was stretched to its limit in the Ardennes, the engineer water supply detachments kept producing water anyway, because the doctrine governing those units had been built with exactly this kind of stress scenario in mind. Water supply is a function that continued operating under combat pressure rather than a peacetime convenience that evaporated the moment conditions became difficult. Military medical historians use a specific phrase to describe what the Second World War did to the relationship between American soldiers and infectious disease. They call the period from 1775 to 1918 the disease era, and the period from 1941 onward, the trauma era. The line between them runs directly through the middle of the 20th century. Through the disease era, more American military personnel died of infectious illness than of enemy action, in the long aggregate across nearly a century and a half of conflict. The trauma era reversed that ratio permanently. American soldiers in every war since 1941 have died overwhelmingly from combat injuries rather than disease, and the inversion is dated with unusual precision to the Second World War itself. The peer-reviewed medical literature documenting this transition treats it as one of the genuinely significant inflection points in the history of military medicine, comparable in magnitude, though far less discussed publicly, to the development of antibiotics or modern trauma surgery. The bacteria did not change. Contaminated water remains exactly as dangerous to the human body in any era. A soldier drinking from an untreated tropical stream in 2024 faces essentially the same pathogens that killed Union soldiers in 1863. What changed was the architecture surrounding the soldier. Sulfa drugs and penicillin contributed enormously to the broader trauma-era transition, allowing wound infections that would have been fatal in earlier conflicts to become survivable. Vaccines against tetanus and typhoid contributed, removing entire disease categories from the equation before a soldier ever deployed. DDT, deployed against louse-borne typhus to dramatic effect in Naples in 1943 and later in the liberated concentration camps, contributed enormously. The Naples typhus outbreak of late 1943 and early 1944 was halted through what remains one of the most successful public health interventions in military history, with DDT dusting stations established throughout the city and typhus incidents collapsing within weeks of the program's start. But underneath all of it sat the water. The canteen in the foxhole, the mess kit cup at the field kitchen, the Lyster bag on its tripod at the edge of a captured village, the ERD Lator van humming at a forward water point while an anonymous corporal checked the chlorine residual every 20 minutes. Of the roughly 17 million wartime hospital admissions for illness, official Army medical historians attribute a plurality to gastrointestinal disease specifically, the single category the water system was built to address, ahead of malaria, respiratory illness, and every other infectious category tracked separately in the post-war statistical compilations. German prisoners interrogated by American intelligence in the war's closing months left a documented record of what historians have described as weary astonishment, not at American firepower, but at the ordinary conditions of American military life that they encountered as captives. Hot showers, upholstered seats on prisoner transport trains, the expectation that a request for medical attention would actually be honored. And the water? Clean, plentiful, unremarkable to the Americans handing it to them, and almost unbelievable to soldiers who had spent years on the Eastern Front, watching their own army die of disease by the trainload. These interrogation records, scattered across National Archives holdings from facilities including Camp Tracy and various field interrogation centers, contain an unexpected secondary detail. Several captured German medical officers, once processed and held in long-term POW camps in the continental United States, specifically requested access to American sanitation manuals and Lyster bag specifications, citing intentions to write reports for eventual transmission home through Red Cross channels. Whether any such reports reached Berlin is unclear from the surviving record. What the request itself demonstrates is that the German medical system, even from inside a prisoner camp with no further influence over the war's outcome, recognized the system as worth documenting precisely because their own army had never managed to build an equivalent. This decision was made by men whose names appear nowhere in the popular narrative of the Second World War. Quartermaster Corps officers who fought budget battles in the 1920s and 1930s against congressmen who saw no political value in water purification line items. Medical department researchers who refined Halazone dosing protocols through incremental field testing rather than dramatic discovery. The sanitation NCOs who trained at Fort Sam Houston and other Army schools before deploying to companies where their job was, on its surface, the least glamorous assignment available. Testing chlorine residuals, maintaining canvas bags, distributing tablets that soldiers complained about and rarely thanked anyone for providing. The basic three-tier architecture these men built, individual tablets, unit-level treatment, dedicated engineering infrastructure, remained the conceptual template for American military water doctrine through Korea, where it again proved its value against an even colder winter environment, and into Vietnam, where it confronted tropical conditions in many respects more demanding than the Pacific had been. The specific equipment evolved. Reverse osmosis units eventually replaced the Lister bag. More sophisticated chemical agents replaced Halazone. Later conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan saw the direct organizational descendant of the 405th Engineer Water Supply Battalion establishing purification units at forward operating bases within days of their establishment, the institutional heir of a doctrine first written down during interwar years when almost no one in Washington considered the subject worth a budget line. William Lyster died in 1947 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery in a grave that few visitors seek out. The privates of the 1517th Engineer Water Supply Company received no statues. The men who filled the canteens and tested the chlorine residual stayed in the institutional shadow that every army casts over its logistics personnel, while the medals went, as they generally do, to the men who broke the enemy's lines and crossed the rivers. A 1946 Internal Army Historical Survey of decorations awarded during the war found exactly 2 Bronze Stars issued specifically for water supply engineering actions across the entire conflict, a number that reflects not the unimportance of the work, but the institutional reflex that reserves decoration for actions visible to the men issuing them, and combat is visible in a way that a properly functioning Lister bag never is. The German major near Liège never got a satisfying answer according to the surviving transcript. His interrogators were tactical specialists, not historians, with no reason to walk him through 30 years of Quartermaster Corps budget fights. He was processed, transferred to a Midwestern POW camp, and disappears from the record, one of several thousand German officers who passed through the American prisoner system without further note. His question outlived him in the archive longer than his name did. The bullet would have killed either soldier in an instant. The cold would have killed either of them in a single night. The water was where the long, invisible mathematics of the war actually accumulated, a tiny daily dividend paid quietly to millions of men that determined with disproportionate frequency who came home and who did not.